Hey YouTubers, so today I'm talking about a really popular topic, which is cheat meals and refeeds. So I start by defining them so we can tell them apart. I talk about benefits and expectations of both of them, how we might be setting up a refeed versus how a cheat meal is usually set up, and then I finish on the attitudes behind a cheat meal versus a refeed. Okay, I hope you learn a lot. Bye! Let's dive straight in. I wanted to cover this topic because there seems to be a fair bit of confusion around the differences between cheat meals and diet breaks. Some people even use the words interchangeably, which is problematic because they're not the same thing. So we can't use the words interchangeably. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to cover definitions, the benefits of both of them, what you can expect out of both of them, the setup of cheat meals and refeeds, the attitudes behind them, and then I'm going to give a summary. And who knows, maybe some other fun stuff are going to pop up along the way. Okay, so starting with definitions, I'm going to kick it off with cheat meals. As the name implies, it's a single meal that veers from the usual habits or rules of your diet. While a cheat day is the same thing, but instead of being a single meal, it's an entire day where those rules don't apply. So usually when people are having a cheat meal, there's no rules or regulations around the quantity of food or the type of food that they can eat. Sometimes if there are rules, they might just be loose rules like whatever you can fit on one plate if you're having a single cheat meal, or whatever you can eat in 2 hours, for example. But outside of that, it's pretty much a free-for-all. When we look at the attitudes behind refeeds and cheat meals later, we're going to touch on this a little bit more. But usually when people are having a cheat meal, it's because their diet is fairly restrictive and their food they're eating is, boiled chicken and rice and pretty plain, simple foods that people might find bland and unenjoyable. So when people begin a cheat meal, the food types that they're choosing are usually highly palatable, meaning that there's a high fat and carb content. And the science shows us that people find it very difficult to restrict quantity of highly palatable foods or really high fat foods. So we can think things like burgers, pizza, chips, ice cream, all the good stuff. Before we move on to the definition of a refeed, cheat meals are usually not calculated. The calories and the macronutrients, what makes up the calories, aren't usually accounted for. It's just food that the dieter wants to eat in the quantity that they want to eat it in. Okay, so refeeds. This is an intentional, calculated, and planned increase in calories, usually coming from carbohydrates. Actually, it should come from carbohydrates. Some people who do a refeed don't know that, and they might increase calories through, mainly fats and protein, but we're talking about a normative refeed or how it ought to look. Unlike a cheat meal, a refeed is not a single meal, but rather an increase in calories for the whole day. And also, we would be wise to have at least 2 consecutive days of higher calories. Now, when I say high calories, this isn't an infinitely high number of calories, but rather an increase to TDE calories, or the calories that we've calculated that you can maintain weight on. Why refeeds aren't just a single meal, or usually done on a single day, are for physiological benefits. So if you want some more insight into that, that's a different can of worms. So I'd suggest you check out, it's a Revive Stronger podcast. It's called Refeeds Revisited, and Lyle McDonald was the host on that, and it's explained quite eloquently. Anyone who knows Lyle, including Lyle himself, would agree he can be a bit of a douche, but his information is great. So just look past the douchiness and enjoy the info. Okay, so now that we've covered the definitions, what is a cheat meal and what is a refeed, we're going to look at the benefits and expectations of them. We'll start at cheat meals again. The main reasons people engage in cheat meals usually is psychological benefits. They seem to have a lot of what we call diet fatigue, where they're just, thinking about food all the time, hungry all the time, feeling heavily restricted. And so this cheat meal gives them the opportunity to eat something delicious, reduce their hunger for a moment in time, and reduce their severe cravings. There's 3 things we can expect. 3 things we can expect from a cheat meal. First one could be improved diet adherence. So if someone for 6 days of the week is sick of their food, but they know on the 7th day they get to eat, an entire pizza and tub of ice cream, they're more likely to push through and adhere to their diet a little bit more. The other thing we can expect is quite literally a shitstorm. So if somebody is very heavily restricted on their food intake during the week, maybe they've removed gluten, they've removed dairy, they've removed like a whole host of things because they think that it's necessary to lose weight, and then a cheat meal is like a huge meal and dense in gluten, dense in dairy, things that they're no longer equipped to deal with anymore because they're not delivering it to their body on a regular basis, then we can expect a lot of bloating, maybe some diarrhea, maybe a lot of gas, maybe all of the above. And this can send people into a loop of thinking that they're gluten intolerant, whereas in fact the devil's in the dosage. The third thing we can expect is either feelings of relief, because they're like, oh, finally I've relieved this craving, or feelings of guilt, because typically we'll look at this when we look at attitudes later on, but people who engage in cheat meals, not all the time, but most of the time, seem to group food as good food and bad food, and they eat their good food when they're not having a cheat meal and their bad food when they are having a cheat meal. And sometimes people tie themselves to these groups. When I eat good food, I am good, I am being good. When I eat bad food, I am bad, or I am being bad. And this kind of takes us down the slippery slope to something we call orthorexia, which is a clinically recognized eating disorder. So if you're feeling like some of this might relate to you, it might be worth reaching out to a food psychologist to help you along your way, because it's something a lot of people do experience that goes undiagnosed and untreated. And because there can be feelings of shame around eating bad food or binge eating, we tend not to talk about it. But that doesn't mean that it's not a very common issue. It is. Okay, benefits and expectations of refeeds. Some people like to crap on about metabolic damage. If we can just understand what they mean by that, we'll realize that a metabolism when we're dieting isn't damaged, but a better way to frame this is negative metabolic adaptations. So we have a whole host of hormones that are affected by our dietary choices and our caloric intake. And when we're chronically suppressing our calories, which is the only way to lose fat, then our hormones adjust. We can think of that as a survival mechanism to stop us from starving to death. So our body makes us hungrier, it makes food smell better, it makes food taste better, it makes us lethargic so we move less. So these negative metabolic adaptations, at least acutely, can be adjusted positively through a refeed, if that refeed comes from increased carbohydrates, that is. Now, outside of improvements in metabolic rate acutely after a refeed, the other things we can expect are things like reduced diet fatigue, improved energy, increase in weight, I'll explain that in a tick, better pumps in the gym, decreased hunger, and just like cheat meals, refeeds can also help people with their dietary adherence, as I mentioned. So just to quickly touch on the weight gain, and I also want to mention leptin as sort of the spotlight in positive metabolic adaptations. When I say weight gain from a refeed, so long as the calories set in the refeed aren't exceeding excessively your maintenance calories or your TDEE calories, that weight gain should not come from fat gain. But rather, we know when we consume carbohydrates and we're sufficiently hydrated, we're going to store those carbohydrates in our skeletal muscle and liver tissue as something called glycogen. So glycogen is just a carb plus water. There's about 3 grams of water or fluid attached to each gram of carbohydrate we store, and that's going to show up on the scales as increased weight. We can think of that as like glycogen saturation. When we're eating less carbs and we're exercising and using glycogen as fuel, we can think of that as glycogen depletion. Although we're not entirely depleted, we're just reducing our glycogen stores. When we eat more carbs and we're sufficiently hydrated, we're increasing those stores So we can think of that as glycogen saturation. So that's where this weight gain is coming from, not necessarily fat gain. And people do confuse the two, and people who are unaware of that and have a refeed and then jump on the scales think, holy shit, I've done something wrong. We should also, side note here, mention that maybe you have done something wrong. Maybe the calories on your refeed were far too high and it's a combination of glycogen and fat gain. Or maybe you didn't increase calories from the right macronutrient. Maybe far too much of it did come from fat. Also, side note, if calories were too high. Because even if carbs are really low and fats were quite high, so long as you're in a deficit, fat gain should not occur. So I'm not saying that that is the case. Now, to talk about leptin. Leptin is a hunger hormone released and stored in our adipose tissue or our fat, and it plays a key role in hunger signaling and satiety. We can think of leptin as our appetite control hormone. While leptin has many functions in the body, its main function is to control fat cell size. Once it's released from fat cells, it's believed that it signals the brain that the body's had enough food and it's time to stop eating. Because our bodies are great at maintaining homeostasis, it's no surprise that when we eat less and drop body fat, our leptin levels go down. I'm avoiding the word plummet, but maybe that's fair sometimes. And when we gain fat, our leptin levels increase. Refeeds, when done correctly, can spike leptin levels, which helps the dieter infer the fat loss post-refeed. It's worth mentioning though that these spiked leptin levels don't stay high forever. That would be fabulous, but rather they're fairly short-lived, which is why refeeds are done on a fairly regular basis. I should also mention the difference between refeeds and diet breaks here, because they're also commonly confused. A refeed is just a few or a couple of days within a week where calories are higher, whereas a refeed is usually a refeed is usually an extended period of time, like an entire week of higher calories. When we're refeeding, we're usually still in a deficit for the week, in a calorie deficit, that is. But when we're having a diet break, we're bumping calories up for the week and we're no longer in a deficit. Now, although high-fat foods are delicious, as I mentioned, it's important that these increase of calories come from carbohydrates. So that does mean that food choices are still limited on refeed days, which is a bit of a bummer, but we still get a psychological break from eating more food, eating larger portions of food, and not being as hungry. So we can think of a list of foods that are good for refeed days as anything high in carbohydrates and low in fat. So that could be things like bagels or white bread with honey or jam, maybe a pasta with a low-fat sauce, sorbet, low-fat rice pudding, marshmallows or other lollies like Starbursts and Snakes, for example, Gatorades and juice, dried fruit, things like that. We would have a hard time, or most of us would have a hard time, getting in the carbs that we need on a refeed day from whole foods. So if we're using fruits and vegetables or even starchy carbs only, the gastric stress that might be caused from mountains of food might not be worth it. So we usually advise our clients, not all of them, especially those who have a lower carbohydrate needs on refeed days, but most of them to, try some marshmallows or some jam or some dried fruit, things like that. Okay, so now we're moving on to setup. I'll start with the setup of cheat meals and then I'll move on to the setup of refeeds. Let's say that the person in question needs 2,000 calories a day to maintain their weight. So they decide for their weight loss goals, they're going to drop to 1,600 calories. It could look something like this. Let's say you're planning a cheat meal for Saturday. You'll eat your breakfast, lunch, and snacks as usual, but you'll replace your normal dinner with your cheat meal dinner. And that dinner might look something like this. It could be a burger, chips, and some ice cream. We can see here what the total calories are and the macros. And with this additional cheat meal dinner and your usual breakfast and lunch, your calories now look something like this for the day. We can see here for Saturday that they're much higher than what they ought to be if you were trying just to maintain your weight, which we established before for this person is 2,000 calories. This is being pretty polite to cheat meals, because I don't know many people who have snack-sized chips when they go out for a cheat meal, or choose grilled chicken on their burger when they've been eating chicken all week. It might be something more like, deep fried chicken, or, a high-fat beef patty, something like that. And also, this is assuming that on their cheat day, the person's eating exactly to plan, except for the one cheat meal. We do find that when people begin a day where they know they're having a cheat meal, they start to pick here and there as well. So this is being polite to cheat meals. Just going back to the image here of what the macros for the day might look like for this person having the burger, chips, and ice cream. We can see here that the dieter is exceeding the 2,000 calories that they would need to maintain weight by over 600. So fat gain would likely occur in this particular day. But assuming the calories were adhered to on all other days, a weekly deficit was still achieved over the week due to them being in a big enough deficit on the other 6 days. So a net loss should still occur, but at a slower rate. If you're confused as to why I said weight loss might still occur but at a slower rate, this is because the excess calories on the Saturday brought the daily average calories over the week up. So the dieter is in a lesser calorie deficit now relative to what they need to maintain weight, or their TDEE calories, which we've established at 2,000 for this example. But we should keep in mind that this is a pretty controlled looking cheat meal. So if you're doing much more damage in a single cheat meal or a cheat day, it can cancel out the entire week's deficit. No weight loss could be achieved, or even worse, weight gain can occur just from that meal or day. And this is also keeping in mind that the dieter is in a significant deficit on the other 6 days. Some people who do cheat meals aren't really aware of what their calories should be, and even if they are, they don't know how to eat to them. So we find that a lot of people think they're in a significant calorie deficit, but they're only in a small calorie deficit. And then when we add a heavy cheat meal on top of that, they end up being in a surplus over the week. So definitely worth keeping that in mind. Okay, now moving on to the setup of refeeds. As I mentioned, these are calculated and we want the extra calories to come from carbs. But if we also want the dieter to be losing weight in that particular week, we need to make sure that they remain in a calorie deficit for the week, even when we bump up calories for those couple of days or few days. So if we want to be in a deficit without a refeed, it might look something like this. Or if we want to include 2 refeeds but still be in a calorie deficit, it might look something like this. As you can see, I've pulled calories down on non-refeed days. So when calories are pulled up over the weekend, the weekly average calories still work out to be the original 1,600 calories per day. We've just redistributed the calories differently. The difference in setup here between cheat meals and refeeds from a numbers perspective is that the refeeds are calculated and we've thought out what we need to do on the other days to make sure we're still in a deficit. Whereas the cheat meals are not calculated or planned, and it could mean that weight loss is a little bit of guesswork because it's sort of left up in the air. Finally, we're going to finish on the attitudes behind cheat meals and refeeds. Typically, we find that people who do cheat meals have a particular attitude towards dieting or food that puts them in this restriction and binge cycle. So when they're restricting during the week, they're on a diet. When they have their cheat meal, they're off a diet. This sort of attitude towards food can open the floodgates for binging and can make the dieter feel like they've been let off the leash. They can do a lot of damage to the work that they've done all week, which can hamper their results, but also they can have feelings of guilt and sort of this food hangover that comes with that can push them back into that heavy restriction to try and undo the damage that they've done. So clearly not a healthy relationship with food there. Those who track their macros, we find that usually they're strict with their numbers, but not restricted with their food types. Because they're allowed a few squares of chocolate within their macro targets, of course, during the week or a treat here and there, we find that cravings aren't as extreme. So when it's time to have a refeed, there's not the feeling of wanting to dive into a pool of Doritos and bathe themselves in ice cream, because they've been able to have little bits and pieces during the week. So they're okay with bagels and jam or cereal and sorbet or things that are high in carbs that still fit the requirements of their refeed. Again, I'll touch on the fact that this is normative, and sometimes people do approach refeeds in a different way, but I'm discussing how they ought to be approached and the attitudes towards it. Also, though, even though this is normative, it is quite common for people to approach refeeds in this way and cheat meals in that way, previously explained. Hopefully this gives you a comprehensive overview of the difference between cheat meals and refeeds, why we might want to choose one or the other. Even though I haven't explicitly said it, I hope it's obvious which is the superior one. The problem may arise that although it might be clear which is better, you might not know what calories are appropriate for you and for your goals, what macronutrients might be appropriate within those calories, and therefore you're not sure how to set up refeeds or how to count macronutrients. I always say that the best place to start is from the beginning. Work out what calories are right for you, work out what macros you want to split into those calories. From there, get a good grasp of how to accurately track your macronutrients, and it's still going to be quite a few weeks before a refeed is appropriate for you anyway, so it gives you a good chunk of time. That all sounds fine and dandy, but that can be quite a daunting task for some people. So of course, we offer coaching. So feel free to reach out. We don't just tell you what your calories and macros can be. We also have a heavy emphasis on education, so we'll teach you everything you need to know. And that's a wrap for today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check the description below on where you can follow us on other social platforms to get other cool info. Thanks guys, see you in the next video.